Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, December 13th. We are going to be getting started in just a moment or so. So if you're here for our program titled Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, you're in the right place. So just sit back, relax, be patient for a moment, and we will be starting in just a moment or two. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. If you've just joined us and you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program titled Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, How Editors and Print Culture Transformed an Intellectual Tradition, you're in the right place. We're going to be getting started in just a moment or so. We've quite a number of folks registered for this presentation, so we're going to give them a moment to enter from the waiting room, and then we'll begin. Thanks. Okay, it's a few minutes past the top of the hour, and I think we're going to get started. We'll let folks join us in progress from the waiting room. So good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, How Editors and Print Culture Transformed an Intellectual Tradition. This is a live online presentation with Ahmed El-Shamsi, author and associate professor of Islamic thought at the University of Chicago. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. Tonight, we have more than 100 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed, and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. And we simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, How Editors and Print Culture Transformed an Intellectual Tradition. It's a live online presentation by Ahmed El-Shamsi, author and associate professor of Islamic thought at the University of Chicago. Ahmed El-Shamsi studies the intellectual history of Islam, focusing on the evolution of the classical Islamic disciplines and scholarly culture within their broader historical context. His research addresses themes such as orality and literacy, the history of the book, and the theory and practice of Islamic law. Ahmed El-Shamsi's first book, The Canonization of Islamic Law, A Social and Intellectual History, traces the transformation of Islamic law from a primarily oral tradition to a systematic written discipline in the 8th and 9th centuries. His second book, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, how editors and print culture transformed an intellectual tradition, is the focus of his presentation this evening. Now, Islamic book culture dates back to late antiquity, when Muslim scholars began to write down their doctrines on parchment, papyrus, and paper. And then they started to compose increasingly elaborate analyses of and commentaries on these ideas. Movable type was adopted in the Middle East only in the early 19th century, and it wasn't until the second half of the century that the first works of classical Islamic religious scholarship were printed there. But from that moment on, the technology of print transformed Islamic scholarship and Arabic literature. Tonight, Ahmed El-Shamsi will share the story of how a small group of editors and intellectuals brought forgotten works of Islamic literature into print and defined what became the classic canon of Islamic thought. Now, if you have questions for our presenter, please use the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those questions for our conversation out of the chat and the Q&A. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Ahmed El-Shamsi, and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Ahmed, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you to you and to the Book Club of California for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for attending tonight. The historian Thomas Mako once described cultures as islands in the ocean of oblivion. Almost all thoughts that have ever been thought and almost all words that have ever been spoken have been irretrievably lost in this ocean. Yet our species has developed tools to resist oblivion. One of these tools is cyclical repetition. Festivals and rituals, whether religious or otherwise, are commemorations in which we remember and re-remember past events and maintain memory of them by introducing successive generations to them. Another mechanism is orally transmitted poems and stories, such as fairy tales, fables, epic poems like the Iliad or pre-Islamic poetry. But the historically most significant invention for preserving memories is writing, a technique first developed in Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. Ever since, writing has been the primary mode of maintaining cultural coherence over time. Writing inscribes ideas and information on physical materials that can be decoded and consumed by contemporaries and future generations alike. Memory thus acquires a home outside of ourselves, and its survival is no longer tied to the survival of those that hold it. This means that the medium of writing can do something that neither rituals nor oral stories can. It can persist even through periods of neglect. An orally transmitted folk tale that is not retold for a generation is gone forever. But a book can lay forgotten for a millennium, and then, as long as the physical object survives and the language it is written in is still known, it can be rediscovered and reintroduced into cultural circulation. Therefore, books can act as something like a cultural subconsciousness, a latent store of ideas and words that can, when the conditions are ripe, re-emerge into contemporary awareness. This is what happened in the European Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries. Forgotten Greek and Latin texts from classical antiquity were rediscovered in places such as monasteries and reintroduced to the reading public, sparking new literary, philosophical, and aesthetic movements. A similar renaissance took place in the Middle East in the 19th and early 20th centuries, only on a much larger scale. This was the rediscovery of classical Arabic literature, much of which had been almost completely forgotten, but which became suddenly, in the space of mere decades, both widespread and hugely popular. Counterintuitively, this renaissance of the Arabic classics was caused and made possible by processes of modernization in Arab countries, especially the adoption of the printing press. There are some high literary traditions that only properly begin with print. For example, the German literary tradition, arguably started with Luther's translation of the Bible into German and its immediate publication in 1534. The Arabic literary tradition, by contrast, predates its conversion to print by more than 1,000 years, and by that time it was both vast and diverse in chronological and disciplinary terms, as well as geographically. It represented a written conversation carried on since the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, initially inscribed in materials such as parchment and papyrus, and since the mid-8th century overwhelmingly on paper. And it encompassed a wide range of genres, from the exegesis of the Quran to the collections of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings, to law, to theology, to philosophy, history, linguistics, grammar, lexicography, prose literature, geography, and poetry. What is remarkable about this tradition is, firstly, its size. It once contained tens of millions of books. Over time, the majority of these books have succumbed to the arch enemies of the written word: humidity, fire, war, insects, and sometimes censorship. But still, it is estimated that from the period between the years 700 and 1400, for example, at least 600,000 manuscript books have survived to the present day. The extant classical Arabic corpus dwarfs the surviving body of classical Greek and Latin texts combined by several orders of magnitude. So the estimations are between 100 and 1,000 times more Arabic texts than Greek and Latin texts. The second striking feature of the Arabic written tradition is its linguistic continuity and internal coherence. For most English speakers, Chaucer's 14th century Middle English in the Canterbury Tales is difficult to comprehend, and the Old English of the 10th century Beowulf resembles a foreign language. By contrast, literary Arabic has undergone only limited change since the recording of the Quran in the 7th century, and as a result, an educated Arabic speaker today can read and understand texts written throughout this period. Finally, the Arabic written tradition not only extends far back in time, but also spans and connects an immense geographic area with countless local vernaculars, from the Volga region in the north to sub-Saharan Africa in the south, and from Spain and Mauritania in the west to Central Asia and India in the east. Over most of this wide chronological and geographical sweep, Arabic literature in its various genres took the form of manuscript codices, written by hand and primarily produced by professional scribes. This meant that books were generally produced on demand. If you wanted a copy of a particular book, you would either copy it yourself from someone else's copy or pay a scribe to make a copy for you. But if a given book wasn't in demand, it didn't get copied. And as manuscripts degrade over time, especially the ones on paper, the lack of new copies and the shrinking number of existing copies eventually threatened the survival of the book itself. The consequences of this phenomenon on a wide scale were evident in the 19th century Middle East. It's not that Arab readers had no books to read at that time. In, for example, madrasas and mosques across the Arab lands, students still gathered around teachers to study and copy written teaching texts, just like they had done for centuries. But since the 16th century, education in the various corners of the Muslim world had become rather scholastic, structured around an increasingly uniform curriculum of works, all rooted in a relatively small number of teaching texts that were encased in multiple layers of subsequent commentaries. So a typical scholarly book read in the Arab world in the beginning of the 19th century would have the succinct base text in the middle of each page, and arrayed around it would be primary commentaries, as well as glosses, which were usually, but not always, based on the primary commentaries, and sometimes tertiary commentaries, that is, commentaries on glosses on commentaries. These commentary layers were fundamentally scholastic in nature, that is, they analyzed in excruciating detail the lexical, rhetorical, and logical features of the base text, but they often had next to nothing to say about the text's actual subject matter. These kinds of books, and especially the commentary layers, were overwhelmingly products of the 16th to 19th century. I call this the post-classical period, to contrast with the earlier classical period. The dominance of such post-classical clusters of base text and commentary was not confined to teaching. The same limited roster of recent books dominated the public and private libraries that we can reconstruct from this period, and they were also the texts that post-classical authors overwhelmingly cited in their own writings. This indicates that 17th to 19th century Arab readers were familiar with a surprisingly narrow range of literature compared to what we have today from the earlier periods. Most of it written within 3 centuries of their lifetimes. Earlier literature survived as quotations or secondhand references in the post-classical works, but the classical books themselves were rarely read, and thus no new copies of them were commissioned. What then of older copies of books from the classical period? They were in peril too. Since the Middle Ages, Arabic books had been preserved primarily in thriving quasi-public libraries that were housed in mosques, madrasas, Sufi lodges, and supported by perpetual pious endowments. This is one of those from Istanbul. But by the 19th century, the collections of most of these institutions were no longer accessible to scholars or the broader public. The Egyptian historian al-Jabarti, who died in the early 19th century, listed the key works of the great classical Arabic historians in the beginning of his own history. But then he wrote this, quote, "These are now merely titles. The works themselves do not exist anymore. We have seen only some fragments of some of them remaining in the endowed libraries of madrasas, whose collections have been scattered by booksellers and sold by administrators and carried to the Maghreb, i.e. to North Africa, and across the Sahara. The last remains were lost in conflicts and wars, or were taken away by the French to their lands." The last being, of course, a reference to Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. Which did lead to a massive outflow of manuscripts to Paris, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Al-Jabarti was right. Indigenous institutions of Arabic book culture were in dramatic decline in the 19th century. In part, this was because the Ottoman conquest of Egypt and Syria in the 16th century had moved the center of political and economic power to Istanbul, and downgraded the former twin hubs of Arabic culture, Cairo and Damascus, to mere provincial capitals, with impoverished resources and plummeting institutional support for scholarship. With a shift in political power came a shift in the fortunes of the Arabic language, which was eclipsed by Ottoman and Persian. The scribal classes, which had been a crucial engine of Arabic written culture ever since the famed early literary courtiers in the 8th century, began to favor Ottoman and Persian in their literary output, and this trend continued until the 19th century. Even religious scholars in non-Arabic speaking areas wrote increasingly in languages other than Arabic. So Arabic, that had been the lingua franca of Islamic scholarship, was kind of pushed out of at least not non-Arabic speaking, native speaking areas. With the loss of resources, support and prestige, few new libraries were founded in the Arab world in the 17th to 19th centuries to preserve rare books, and the existing libraries suffered badly. Their endowments faltered and were not replaced, and they could not afford to pay for necessary repairs, maintenance, and staff. Most importantly, books were relatively easy to convert into money, and this made them the first casualty of shortfalls in endowment income and of embezzlement in times of political instability and diminished legal supervision. In this precarious situation, European book collectors saw a golden opportunity. For European Orientalists, the Arab lands were a storehouse of a still little known intellectual tradition. Beginning in earnest with the French scholars who accompanied Napoleon on his invasion of Egypt in 1798, book collectors, often in the role of colonial administrators and consuls, made fortunes and careers out of the systematic and occasionally unlawful acquisition of Arabic manuscripts for the libraries of Europe and later North Africa. Their phenomenal success is illustrated by the example of Ulrich Jasper Seetzen, a German physician, adventurer, and hobby Orientalist who arrived in Cairo in 1807 on a mission to buy up as many Arabic manuscripts as possible and to send them back to his patron, a German prince. Seetzen observed correctly that the French had plundered significant numbers of manuscripts from Cairo, including priceless fragments of one of the earliest copies of the Quran from the central mosque of Old Cairo. But although the French were said to have carried away 30 camel loads of manuscripts from buildings they had shelled, Seetzen managed to obtain and send back to Germany more than 1,500 manuscripts less than 2 years later. European book collectors like Seetzen had deep pockets and voracious appetites for Arabic manuscripts, and the countless books they funneled overseas were subsequently inaccessible to Arab readers and scholars who often didn't even know of their continued existence. The flow of tens of thousands of Arabic manuscripts out of the Islamic world made a significant dent in the Arabic written tradition. It exacerbated the decline of traditional institutions of book preservation and left works that did not belong to the post-classical curriculum at grave risk of total loss. Indeed, these works might have been lost entirely were it not for a series of developments that were triggered by the modernization of Arab societies and that revolutionized Arabic book culture beginning in the 19th century. I will briefly describe 3 of these developments. The first was the establishment of modern libraries. These were state-funded and regulated institutions dedicated to the systematic collection and preservation of books, including books that were not in common use. These libraries were inspired by and often modeled directly on the research libraries that Arab travelers had encountered on their visits to Europe. One such visitor was the prominent Egyptian bureaucrat and scholar Ali Mubarak, who was deeply impressed by the Orientalist libraries he encountered during his trip to France, and subsequently managed to persuade the Egyptian Khedive Ismail to establish a national library on the model of the French National Library, today's Bibliothèque Nationale. And so this one, the Egyptian National Library, was founded in 1870. The library's mission, as proclaimed by the Khedive, was to rescue valuable endowed manuscripts from dispersal and preserve them for the nation. The Egyptian National Library eventually became one of the 2 most important manuscript collections in the Arab world. The other one was the Zahiriya Library in Damascus, which was the product of the joint efforts of the reformist Ottoman governor Midhat Pasha and a local scholar named Tahir al-Jazairi. The second development that was instrumental for the change of Arab book culture was the rise of a new interest in classical literature among readers who were increasingly impatient with the formalism and technical preoccupation of the post-classical commentary works, and who longed for a broader horizon and for the uncluttered language of classical literature. Some of these readers were part of the mainstream scholarly establishment, such as Hassan al-Attar. Al-Attar had been trained at the Al-Azhar seminary and became its head in 1830, so he was a quintessential establishment figure. But he was dissatisfied with the narrow scholastic orthodoxy of his day, complaining that, quote, "We have confined ourselves to a limited corpus of books that later scholars have written, and we reread these throughout our lives, having no ambition to look into others, as if all knowledge were contained in them," end quote. In response, in his own teaching, and particularly with his closest students, Al-Attar drew on a far wider selection of topics and writings in history, geography, and literature than was common for the seminarians at the time, even drawing on works by controversial and marginalized authors. This emerging appetite for classical works often went hand in hand with a willingness to critique established doctrines. The interests of classically minded scholars, such as Al-Attar, overlapped with those of a different and much larger constituency, namely the emerging elite of well-connected and wealthy book lovers who had at most one foot in the old scholarly tradition, and the other in the structures and discourses of the rapidly modernizing state. This new class of scribal intellectuals valorized high-level Arabic, rare manuscripts, and philological accuracy. They adopted Arabic rather than Ottoman or Persian as the language of high culture, and sought to achieve a cultural renaissance through the rediscovery of texts that had been largely forgotten, especially histories, ethical advice literature, and early works of poetry and prose. Prominent cultural figures vied with each other to uncover long-lost treasures, flaunting their discoveries in their weekly literary salons. An evocative anecdote that illustrates the ethos of this class concerns the collected poems of the famous 9th century Arab poet al-Buhturi. In spite of al-Buhturi's fame, his collected poems were unknown and unavailable in late 19th century Egypt. So when one collector heard that a bookseller had brought a copy of the work to Cairo, he rushed to buy it, only to be told that the bookseller had promised the manuscript to another collector. Undeterred, the first one persuaded the seller to rent the manuscript from him for 24 hours for an exorbitant sum, and then had his in-house copyists work feverishly through the night to produce a copy of this book. The next day, he returned the original to the bookseller, who promptly delivered it to the other collector. At the next salon, the buyer, unaware of his competitor's coup, boasted of owning Cairo's only copy of al-Buhtari's poem. His opponent haughtily pulled out his own copy and exclaimed, "Calm down, my brother, we have already engorged ourselves on this." Last but not least, the third development, which paralleled and amplified the other two, was the adoption of printing as the central medium of book production and circulation. The technology of printing had arrived in Istanbul via Jewish refugees from Spain within decades of Johannes Gutenberg's death in 1468. But Arabic books were not printed in the Middle East until the 18th century. In part, the reason lies in the relatively small size of the reading public for book-length prints in Arabic, which was further constrained by the post-classical preference for Ottoman and Persian literature. Even in an important Arab country such as Egypt, the potential readership for a printed book around the year 1800 probably numbered in the mere tens of thousands. When Arabic books finally began to be printed in the 18th century, the technology was initially used either for the printing of technical texts such as manuals and dictionaries, or for the small-scale confessional literature of non-Muslim communities, such as Christians in Lebanon. Arabic and Islamic literature continued to be reproduced exclusively by hand until the 19th century, when printing was finally harnessed for this purpose. The central place for this development was Egypt, where the modernizing ruler Muhammad Ali had established a state-owned printing press in Cairo's port of Bulaq in 1822. The more than 300 titles published by the Bulaq press in its first 20 years operation were overwhelmingly technical manuals in the fields of medicine, mathematics, military sciences, and the like. They included only a handful of works belonging to the Arabo-Islamic scholarly tradition, in particular works of Arabic language, grammar, and syntax, used in the newly established state schools, and bare bones primaries on theology and law that were part of the post-classical curriculum. So this is the image of the first book published there, and this is an Italian Arabic dictionary. So you can see the importance of this was partly also to enable Egyptians to read kind of and translate manuals from European languages into Arabic. However, in the late 1840s, the state press decided to permit private individuals to use its facilities in order to publish books of their own choice. These individuals transformed the book publishing landscape. Book collectors, such as the Buhtari aficionado I mentioned before, rented the state press to print copies of some of their most prized manuscripts, thus making widely available works that had until then been legendary for their rarity. So if you imagine, manuscript production is something that happens on a one-on-one basis. So you produce one copy, then you produce another copy. But with print, you can suddenly, within a relatively short time, produce 1, 2, 3, 5,000 copies of a work, which can make a big difference. A prominent public figure, such as Rifat al-Tahtawi, used their exceptional access to the instruments and resources of the state to promote the printing of books that were dictated neither by school curricula nor by profit considerations, but rather by the overarching goal of introducing forgotten but valuable ideas to the Arabic reading public. One of the books that al-Tahtawi saw into print was Ibn Khaldun's now famous 14th century Monkodema, which has been called both a philosophy of history and a foundational work of sociology. The Monkodema was published for the first time in 1857. Its publication offers a case study of the journey of a classical text from manuscript to print form in the second half of the 19th century, and it illustrates the many pitfalls that beset this journey. The practical work of establishing the precise text to be printed was carried out by an employee of the Bulaq press, a so-called corrector. In this case, a certain Nasr al-Hurini. Correctors in the age of print were not independent scholars, but rather employees of the press who carried out necessary steps in the printing of any book, whether classical or contemporary, Arabic work, or a translation from another language. The task of the corrector was primarily one of proofreading. First, the handwritten script that formed the archetype for typesetting the pages had to be checked for errors, and then the typeset pages had to be checked against the script. Finally, when the base manuscript contained corrupted sections, the corrector had to do what he could to piece together the missing or problematic passages in order to produce a readable text. Al-Hurini's first task as the corrector of Ibn Khaldun's Monkodema was to find a suitable manuscript or manuscripts to serve as the basis of the printed text. Even though Ibn Khaldun had written the last version of the work in Cairo 500 years earlier, by the mid-19th century, most copies of the work were held in the libraries of Istanbul. Al-Hurini had no access to these manuscripts. There was no way of requesting manuscript copies from abroad, and travel to Istanbul was well beyond his job description. He couldn't even access reliable information about the manuscripts, since the Istanbul collections had not yet been catalogued. The copy that Al-Hurini ended up using as the basis of his work was the only one he managed to find in Egypt, and it was of inferior quality. He did his best. He checked parts of the text against the second copy belonging to a Moroccan scholar who happened to pass through Cairo, and he relied on his universally acknowledged mastery of Arabic to correct the manuscript's many spelling mistakes. The resulting publication was still deeply flawed, with numerous misreadings and omissions that Al-Hurini simply couldn't remedy with the limited resources and time at his disposal. But the book nonetheless proved enormously influential among Arab intellectuals. It became a keystone work of political theory and a model of elegant Arabic prose for writers and journalists. These are three of the developments that supported the rediscovery of Arabic classics in the early 19th century: the foundation of modern libraries, an explosion of interest in classical literature, and the new availability of print technology. This technology could disseminate rediscovered works quickly and efficiently. Other factors that played a role included the spread of public education and of mass print media such as journals and newspapers, which enabled information about literary works to reach the growing reading public. All of these trends set the stage for a wave of editions and prints of classical works of Arabic literature and Islamic thought in the second half of the 19th century and beyond. And in the early 20th century, many of the agents of this movement began to carry a new professional label, that of editor, a philological expert whose role surpassed the limited mandate of the corrector. The work of locating, piecing together, and editing classical works, and of securing publishers and financing for their printing, was carried out by a diverse range of individuals. Many of them were motivated by visions of reform, and they sought to use the resuscitated works to combat contemporary cultural, social, and religious ills. So they targeted books whose ideas and aesthetics they felt could contribute to the revival of Islamic and Arabic culture, and they inaugurated institutions, practices, and networks to support the dissemination of their discoveries across society. The motivations, goals, and approaches of these bibliophiles and editors were diverse. Some sought to reinvigorate the established scholarly tradition, others to undermine it. Some emphasized the socially relevant messages conveyed in rediscovered older works, while others focused on their aesthetically superior form. Some consciously followed the Orientalist tradition of editing and scholarship. Others used classical texts as a tool to critique Orientalism and its claim to privileged expertise. All had to contend with the formidable challenges posed by centuries of cultural neglect of the classical literature. Ahmed Zaki, for example, used the technology of photography to recover classical texts that had been taken out of the Arab world. He traveled extensively, visiting manuscript libraries in Europe, in European countries, and in Istanbul, and photographing manuscripts that he and others then edited and published back home. The efficiency made possible by the new technique of photography and printing is illustrated by the fact that two books that he discovered in the library of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul and then edited and published went in 3 years from the utter obscurity of the Sultan's private library to the syllabus of all of Egypt's preparatory schools. The well-known reformer Muhammad Abdu on the right on your screen, meanwhile focused on language. In his view, post-classical Arabic prose with its florid ornamentation and Persianate style was a central obstacle to Egypt's cultural renaissance. What the country needed instead was a model of language that was suited to clear public discourse and the formulation and expression of ethical sentiments. To counter this decadence, Abdu used his position at the helm of the state newspaper to require private newspapers to hire editors who would ensure the use of correct and clear Arabic in their pages. He even organized mandatory evening classes for these editors, in which he used Ibn Khaldun's Monkodema, that I spoke about a moment ago, among other texts, as teaching material. At the Al-Azhar seminary, his alma mater, Abdu taught the Iraqi philosopher Miskawayh's ethical text, The Refinement of Character, which is from the 10th century, of which a single manuscript survives in Egypt. Afterwards, one of his students, impressed with the book's message, edited and published it, making it an instant staple in the field of ethics. Abdu also founded an initiative called the Society for the Revival of Arabic Books, which systematically searched for, procured, and published rare classical works. This was one of the countless innovative institutions, including various book clubs and crowdfunding schemes, that was set up in this period to support the discovery and popularization of Arabic classics through print. Other reformers rediscovered classical works for religious reform. For example, the Damascene scholar Al-Qasimi scoured manuscript collections for classical books that he felt could contribute to his goal by introducing new or forgotten arguments into scholarly discourse. In this project, he collaborated with a vast transnational and cross-confessional network of like-minded book collectors, scholars, and funders. Al-Qasimi's network included prominent Sunni Muslim reformers such as Tahir al-Jazairi in Syria and Egypt, Mahmoud Shukri al-Alusi in Iraq, wealthy traders in the Arabian Peninsula with an interest in classical books, Wahhabi scholars in Najd, Christian book enthusiasts such as the Iraqi priest Anastas al-Karmali, i.e. the Carmelite, an important Kurdish Baha'i publisher, Farajallah Zaki al-Kurdi in Cairo, Zaydi scholars in Yemen, Imami Shiites in the seminaries of Najaf, and last but not least, European Orientalists such as Louis Massignon, with whom Al-Qasimi exchanged both information and manuscripts. The goal of Al-Qasimi and his fellow reformers was not the establishment of some sort of pure mythical vision of Islam. Rather, they sought to expand the horizons of Islamic thought and practice beyond post-classical traditionalism by drawing on the resources contained in classical literature. They were optimistic about the capacity of human reason and confident that the best argument would eventually carry the day. Therefore, they willingly published writings by authors as different and divergent as Muslim philosophers like Avicenna, Christian philosopher Yahya ibn Adi, famous Sufis like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Arabi, as well as theologians and jurists. To summarize, the 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed a revolution in Arabic and Islamic literature. With all the transformations in Arab societies, the spread of literacy, the establishment of modern state structures, the challenge of European domination, and so on, the growing Arabic reading public became increasingly impatient with the literary values of its post-classical predecessors and demanded literature that spoke to the concerns and aesthetics of their own time, literature that they found in part by reaching into the past and resurrecting books that had been forgotten for centuries. The range of available books and ideas thus expanded dramatically. Reformers of various stripes, frustrated by the religious and cultural orthodoxies of their time, took advantage of these developments to mine the literary tradition for indigenous and authentic resources with which to reform language, ethics, theology, law, and religious life. The technology of printing and the publishing industry that grew around it served as a magnifier that allowed even works that had all but disappeared from circulation, sometimes clinging to existence in a single forgotten manuscript copy, to be re-injected into the cultural bloodstream. Let me leave you with a concrete example of this phenomenon. In Juha al-Harithi's novel, Celestial Bodies, for which she won the Man Booker Prize 2 years ago, The novel contains a scene in which al-Harithi describes the library of the protagonist's family, sometimes in the second half of the 20th century, a very typical library for its time. One of the books on its shelves is the Dove's Necklace, a treatise on love written by Ibn Hazm in Muslim Spain over 1,000 years earlier. But that book very nearly did not make it to us across the ocean of oblivion I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. In fact, only a single manuscript of it survived into the 20th century, now housed in the Leiden University Library in the Netherlands. This is an image. From where it was edited and published, first by an Orientalist scholar in 1914, and then by an Arab editor in Cairo in 1964. So the classics of Arabic and Islamic literature that we have today and that underpin so much of contemporary Arabic culture and scholarship did not reach us through some organic, inevitable flow of tradition. Rather, they're the products of a process of rediscovery that is surprisingly modern. This rediscovery relied on the tireless efforts of countless unsung and often unknown book lovers, as well as, not insignificant doses, of sheer chance. Thank you.
I'm back. I'm going to also right now take this moment to encourage anyone who has a question or a comment that they would like to make to put something in the chat and the Q&A. Now would be a great time to do that. I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to start with really just a thank you for sharing your work, your research, all of this scholarship with us. I'll be honest, I knew nothing about any of this and how the printing press and print culture really did transform the Middle East, people's libraries, people's lives in so many ways, and just the sheer volume of texts and writings that were available and manuscripts and how they were developed and shared is really just so interesting and something that I had never really thought about before. So thank you for sharing all of that. I love the idea that you started out with books as our kind of cultural subconscious, which I think is a great way to launch into this massive and new topic, at least for me. I was wondering if, as people can put stuff in the chat in the Q&A, otherwise I'll have all my questions out here. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the subject. It seems there's a wide variety of subject matter in manuscripts and then later in books that were printed. And I think you mentioned some of them. I mean, you mentioned poems, for example, and histories, religious texts. Was it really everything that we're talking about when you're talking about this kind of revolution and rediscovery in terms of subject matter in print?
Yeah, zoology. Yeah. I mean, obviously there is. I don't know. You might have had text of geometry or these kind of things. I mean, there's obviously with the in the 19th century you have this rapidly developing natural sciences. So if you have Ptolemaic astronomy, whatever, that's read maybe for historical interest, but not actually to kind of understand astronomy anymore.
Yeah, you mentioned texts for I lost it, but different kind of manuals, right? Manuals for different things were also part of it. So I had a question about the scribes that you mentioned early on in terms of the manuscript, and who were the scribes that were doing this work? And someone asked, did the original author of the earliest text write things out themselves, or did they attach themselves and acquire scribes to do that work? How were those original works captured?
So in contrast, let's say to the kind of classical kind of Greco-Roman works, we actually have for not for the majority, but a significant number of autographs, i.e. the original copies of authors in their own, either in their own handwriting or written by somebody where at the end the author said, for example, we have the Ibn Khaldun's Monkodema that I mentioned a couple of times. We don't have it in his handwriting, but we have one manuscript where at the end he says, I have read this copy and made corrections, and this is a correct copy. But so we have autographs and Arabic book culture lay importance on preserving these autographs. But as I mentioned, particularly with the adoption of paper, kind of pre-modern kind of today we have acid-free paper that doesn't deteriorate, or doesn't deteriorate as badly. But in pre-modern societies, paper is actually more susceptible to destruction than, let's say, parchment would be. But the advantage was that it's much cheaper, so you can have really a mass book market. If you compare this to European, really like early Middle Ages, where they wrote a couple of books on parchment that survived very well, but they could only people couldn't really afford to buy books and write many books. So we do have a class of scribes. There was no such thing as whatever, like monasteries or something like this in the kind of Christian West. These were people who worked in cities, who had their shops where they both copied books and sold them, and bound them, etc. So it was like one-stop shop for book production. And you had authors write their own books. You had them teach their own. I mean, in many occasions, they taught their own books in a study circle with students then copying it for themselves, and or if they had financial means, bringing their scribe with them to copy them for them. And then we have generations of copies of copies. Of course, we have books for which we have 7th, 8th, 10th generation copies, which of course then makes it difficult. You want to edit the text, you need to gather the manuscripts to kind of reconstruct an authoritative or reliable version of the text. But there was some literacy to an extent that was beyond simply religious scholars. But it was in the pre-modern period, obviously not a high degree of literacy. There are estimations of two-digit, like a low two-digit literacy in the Middle Ages, in urban centers at least. I don't know whether that answers your question.
There's so many questions. You're answering all of the questions. I'm particularly interested in libraries, and you mentioned a couple of libraries, both personal library at the end, but then also like kind of the National Library. And clearly that you said that the National Library was instrumental in saving these manuscripts that were fleeing the region by going off to Europe. How did that start? How did the first kind of National Library or
let me start first. So you had from kind of the kind of early medieval period onwards, you had libraries that were somehow publicly accessible, and very often they were endowed libraries, i.e. Private individuals were endowing a library where they, let's say, bought 1,000 books or 5,000 books or 10,000 books, put them in a place, and then they had some sort of a source of revenue. Let's say they endowed a piece of agricultural land or houses in a market, and the revenue from this would then fund this library. And so you had these libraries that were attached to institutions of learning, so madrasas, kind of seminaries, or to mosques, or freestanding public libraries also existed. And kind of with the particularly kind of 18th, 19th, early 19th century, you have, as I mentioned, the kind of these endowed libraries kind of run into financial difficulties. So, for example, they had at a certain point they don't have librarians anymore. if you imagine a library without librarians, nobody rebounds the books, and who's really supervising the books. If it's in a mosque where the books are accessible by ordinary worshippers, they might take out the books, they might not return them. So you have a constant attrition of books, and you have less and less kind of investment into keeping up these books. So one example I give in the book is that there was a famous library in Cairo that still in the year 1500 had something like 4,000 books, and for 1500 that's a large number of books. And when in 1870 the Egyptian National Library was founded, the government forcefully took the libraries of these endowed places and brought them together. And from that library, they had only 57 volumes left out of the 4,000 from 1500. And so in 300 years, you had an attrition of I don't know. I'm not a mathematician, but over 90, way over 90%. So we have that happens, and so these national libraries, these kind of modern national libraries, they really are then based on kind of European models. The Bibliothèque Nationale or the Royal Library, depending on at what point it is kind of inspirational, and of course that you have modern bookkeeping practices. You have librarians that catalog these, and then of course the catalogs also get printed. So in pre-modern times, you had these hand lists. So a library had a hand list. When you go into the library, you can see what books they have, but people in other places don't know what this library has. But now you have printed catalogs, and you can exchange catalogs between libraries. So suddenly you have an international network of libraries that know who has what. So in that sense, again, print is instrumental in also allowing people to know what even exists. And in fact, that is a struggle people still have today. We still are working on kind of, there still isn't an international catalog of Arabic manuscripts. That is still very much something in progress because of how many there are.
Yeah. What about private personal libraries? Were people building their own libraries in their homes, and how did that work? And
sure, there are a lot of private libraries, and so when the Egyptian National Library was founded, they only had something like 20,000 manuscripts that they found from these endowed libraries. But by now you are close to 100,000. So this is just private individuals donating manuscripts. So you see, like, the majority of manuscripts were in private hand. Yeah, I mean, depending, there are good studies on these private libraries, because when people died, like public record offices very often made inventories of the libraries of the people who had died, and so we do have some insights into these private libraries, which in normal circumstances they weren't big libraries. People had like 20 books or something like this in the kind of pre-print era, and then with print, suddenly, of course, people could amass thousands, tens of thousands of books suddenly.
There's a note in the chat that says you didn't mention the library at Baghdad, which was destroyed. Were any of the volumes from there saved, and did they become available for distribution in later centuries?
So that's the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 was described by, I mean, there is a scholarly debate about the degree of destruction that was wrought in Baghdad, and you will find some scholars say, "Oh, this is I mean, we do have whatever stories of the Mongols building bridges from Arabic books over the Tigris, and so in that sense, large scale destruction." And other scholars would say, "No, this is basically kind of." These are just stories of destruction, and we can see that even afterwards, very, very quickly, you had libraries being established in Baghdad. I would say it is something like, my gut feeling so far, I'm actually planning a study in the future to kind of really look into the surviving manuscripts and see this. My gut feeling at the moment is that the truth is somewhere in between. That there definitely was a lot of destruction, but of course there was also this, survive as it is with every, no war utterly destroys civilization, right? That's I mean, despite, however which way we're coming down about this question about what the Mongols did or did not do in Baghdad or in the whole Islamic East, in fact, manuscripts are just much more vulnerable to destruction because you have fewer copies of books. And there was another question in the chat about how many copies were made, and with movable type or general, it was like 2,500 to 3,000 copies at least per print run. And so these very early prints these days are precious. They're not. It's not like the Gutenberg Bible or something like this. You can spend a couple of hundred, maybe $1,000 for these early prints, but it's these books are still available here at the University of Chicago. We have copies. You'll have at Berkeley. You have early Arabic prints. The Arabic printing press in Egypt was really a mass, a production which produced hundreds of thousands of copies within a very short period. And really, you have an explosion. I mean, these are just books. You have newspapers and journals and whatever. So the volume of written material explodes in terms of volume. And so that is something that is that makes of course this goes with the increase of reading public as well. So there is, one of the questions sometimes people ask is, so why did these Arabs not start printing earlier? Right? And I would say it's in a sense I would say it's an economic argument, in the sense that if you have a relatively small reading public, if you do individual handwritten copies, you have no investment. All you need is paper and a pen and some ink. While
Did we lose you? Oh.
Am I back?
You're back. I thought we lost you there. Yeah, you're talking about the investment.
Yeah, so there's very little initial investment. You need only paper and a pen and some ink. While with a printing press, you need to buy the machine, and before you print, you need to have enough paper for thousands of copies. So that makes a big difference.
Yeah, it's a big investment. I'm
Can
gonna.
you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us? Can you hear me? You're frozen again. I'm going to put up in the chat for people who are still here information about the book.
I can hear you.
Great. And he's gone again. Maybe he'll be back in a moment. I'm going to put the information about the book up in the chat for anybody who might be interested in finding out more about Ahmed's book. See if he can get back on here in a second so we can wrap up. If he's not back in a second, we can wrap up without him. But there were a couple of questions that we did want to ask him before he disappeared. Well, maybe not. Maybe he's not making his way back to the meeting. So it is 6 o'clock here, so we can wrap up. If he then he is back. I was just about to wrap up, but you're back.
I really apologize. Something happened.
Yeah, might be having internet problems.
Yeah.
I just put up in the chat the information about the book for people who might be interested, and I'm going to see if there's any last questions up in there that we wanted to talk about. But your last comment about investing in a press and large runs kind of begs the question about who were publishers? Were there actual publishers? Who is deciding what books we're going to get printed in the 2,000, 3,000 copies, and how are they going to get distributed?
So originally there was just a government press that did its own business for state business. But then they realized, well, we actually have, there are times in which we're not using the press, so we can have private individuals print books if they pay us for the usage of our facilities. So then you had basically people who were who had originally been scribes, who had like a scribal bookshop. You rent these facilities to print books. And then the next stage was that these people then bought kind of old government presses and opened their private presses. So that's from the 1850s, 60s onwards, when you have the proliferation of private presses. And they do it for all kind of, you have Muslim printing presses, Jewish, Christian, and Baha'i, whatever. People just keep printing stuff from each other's religious traditions, etc. And so there's a really rich, like Egypt becomes like the hub of print. I mean, I talk a lot about Egypt because Egypt becomes the hub of print in the Arab world. So even from other countries, people send have books printed in Egypt, and then they get sent to other countries as well.
Were books illustrated, or was it mostly type at that point? When they started to be printed, were there illustrations as well, or was it mostly type?
They were primarily type. We have, I mean, one thing I didn't mention, there is movable type that is dominant in Egypt, but you also have things like lithography, which in the West, of course, we primarily know through like using it for printing illustrations. But particularly in places like India, Iran, and actually North Africa, lithography was used for book printing because you could basically, I mean, these printed books look like manuscripts. So you could have somebody write something, and it's handwriting. It's not print, like there's something, the block-shaped print that is very different from handwriting. But with lithography, you can basically have printed books that look like manuscripts. So the step isn't, like, aesthetically, it's not a grand step from this to that. Of course, the disadvantage is that for lithography, you can't have more than normally like 500 copies, and then these stones kind of wear out. But so you have even an aesthetic difference between some countries and other countries, and how the prints look that they produced. In Egypt, it was movable type, and so they developed a specific kind of type and kind of aesthetic of writing. But most, I mean, the classical works. Generally, I mean, there are of course some works like geography, whatever, zoology or whatever that do have illustrations. That did have illustrations in the manuscript age as well, but it was less of a well, and then of course modern works, whatever, have illustrations as well. But I would say the usual manuscript doesn't have illustrations. It's more of an exception.
Right. I'm going to ask one question from the chat, but I have a question because I was so fascinated by the primary commentaries that were, around text, and tertiary commentaries, and that whole phenomenon of how people add to those manuscripts and those texts. How long does that continue on? Is there a certain period of time where that was the thing and how people dealt with manuscripts, and then it kind of went away?
Yeah. So it was like, 16th, 17th, and 18th century, I would say, was the high point of these commentaries, and then people kind of got sick and tired of it, like particularly in the modern period. And it's funny that we have these commentaries, and I have colleagues, and we sat together, we're trying to read these texts, and it's you have to really learn how to read these like multi-level commentaries. It's not easy. You can just figure out what is this commenting on what, visually and in terms of linguistically. So it became very scholastic in those preoccupations of what you can do and how you can be clever with language, and maybe you write a commentary that only uses half of the letters of the alphabet, to show your linguistic prowess in doing this. So it's kind of playfulness, whatever, but also a little bit kind of just formalistic, as that can be, and this kind of movement, this kind of neoclassicism, right? So neoclassicism you also use, let's say, for Arabic poetry, that became like much simpler again. I mean, in fact, it's kind of eerily reminiscent of kind of Renaissance in Europe, where people said, "Oh yeah, this barbaric Latin of the kind of Middle Ages, we go back to the old Latin, to the proper Latin." It's not unlike that. So it's kind of also stylistically that older Arabic is simpler and it's clearer and it's more suitable to express ideas rather than just be clever and wordplay, etc.
Yeah, so interesting. The whole commentary thing is really fascinating. I could see it getting lost in it for hours and reading around stuff and what does that mean and why is it said that way. And so, yeah, that's pretty cool. One follow-up question about the home library, because I have a friend who's in the chat here. Reed is asking, before printing became common in the Islamic world, what would the design of a good home library look like? He's big into home libraries.
There were, for example, these kind of collections, these kind of collections of good poetry or of prose. So these were kind of later, how do you call that in English? Works that brought stuff together of various sources, of various, like a collection, collection. There were specific kind of collections of poetry, specific stories that 1001 Nights, for example, is a, it became such epics, like in specific hero epics of knights. There's this Black Knight, Antar. His story was both publicly performed in cafe houses, for example, but also you had them in written form. There's one specific, let's say, poem in praise of the Prophet Muhammad, or there's specific books that one keeps, encountering in these home libraries, but relatively limited in terms of what one finds. If you compare it to the whole body of literature that we have and that we have access to today.
So was the home library like a central part of the home, or was off in a different area? Was there a special way that manuscripts were stored?
It's difficult to make that general statement because we have really different. If you go to a place, let's say like Mauritania, like on the very, very, very west of the Muslim world, where you have, very little kind of book culture on paper, where people write stuff down. They have like a slate, like a wooden slate on which they write stuff down. They memorize it, they wipe it clean, and they write it again. Where you still today you find people who know 100,000 lines of Arabic poetry by heart, and like where much of the stuff that you learn, that you read, you memorize, and different places just having different types of interactions with books. If I have to say, like, one common feature that is very different from Western libraries is that the books in a classical Arabic library are they're stacked this way. They're not. You don't keep them this way. You keep them on top of each other like this. So all illustrations we have of libraries have the books like stacked on top of each other in shelves, not this way.
Nice. Well, we're way past the top of the hour now, even with a little technical difficulty. Now it's about 10 minutes after, so we should wrap up. And I'm going to use something you said earlier to kind of wrap us up. You said, "Calm down, my brother. We have already engorged ourselves in this." And that's a way to end this terrific talk. I want to thank you so much for being here. This was really terrific and in many ways mind expanding. I'm so now interested in learning more about this rediscovery and the whole new wave of printing, how printing came in after so long of in manuscripts and kind of redeveloped. And it keeps saying rediscovery, but kind of redeveloped the culture. It's very exciting and very interesting. So thank you so much for sharing that with us tonight. I also want to thank you, everyone, for attending this Book Club of California program. We are going to be back in January of 2022, bringing you a series of in-person and online programs focused on the history of San Francisco. So starting on Monday, January 10th, you get a little holiday break from us from December 13th to January 10th. That'll be our first program in the new year. It's actually a fun one. It's titled San Francisco Beer, A History of Brewing by the Bay. That'll be an in-person program at the book club. And you can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the book club. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Ahmed, thank you so much for being here. I know it's a little later where you are, so thanks for staying up a little late for us. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself, and we'll see you soon at the book club. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.